when I went to the Netherlands in Amsterdam, I went to Bafunk. At that stage, Bafunk was a professor in missiology. I did so because I was I intended to go into the mission when I go back to South Africa. So I did what they call science of missions, and but my dissertation in was more something of systematic theology than. But although it is called in missionary perspective, it is basically a systematic theology theme that I took, the unity of the church. And the unity of the church, and as a prerequisite for a successful mission to wherever you go. That is so. The dissertation is a mix of systematic theology and what you would call at that stage missiology. The later stage, I moved over completely to systematic theology. I was in the Netherlands when Jaap and the Cottesloe took place. I can still remember my deceased wife and I. We were in a flat in Amsterdam, and then the person who was Professor Bafunk asked to assist him in supervising my thesis. He came to visit us, and that was when Sharpeville happened. So for us out in the Netherlands, young students there, it was a great shock because we didn't expect it to happen. And then, of course, after Sharpeville and what happened there, when Cottesloe, when they had that, the churches came together as well to discuss the South African situation. I was then aware of it and what they were doing. And that had some repercussions for my own thesis, because I wrote about the church, I wrote about the unity of the church, things that the Cottesloe emphasized, the necessity of having a unity church, church unity in South Africa, and that's what I wrote about. So what happened was when I went back to South Africa, I didn't realize that I would end up in a storm, because what happened was that each year they had a conference at the beginning of with the theological seminary, a conference then with a theological theme, and I was proposed to address them, but when they heard what I wrote in my thesis, that was cancelled. And then Professor Cottesloe, he was a professor at that stage in the University of Stellenbosch, and then he decided. He said then he will hold a alternative conference, so that I could address that alternative conference. And that's what happened when when my wife and I, my deceased wife and I, when we arrived in Stellenbosch, in Cape Town, we at that stage we traveled by boat. It was didn't have the money to fly. That was still, this was the early. That was many years ago. Mm-hmm. That's the beginning of the 60s. That's right. The 60s, and then when I arrived in Stellenbosch, Professor Cottesloe said to me, Jaap, you've arrived in a storm because your thesis is very controversial. and they had an alternative meeting where I addressed them. So the big conference of the beginning of the year that they usually have for the theological faculty, that went on, but there was then an alternative conference in another building, in another hall, which I addressed, because they it was at that stage, and those people were almost in control of the Dutch Reformed Church. So Professor Quilly could say, then he arranged that, and I addressed them. And then you see, I had a call. I had a call from in Holland to go to Port Elizabeth as a missionary, as the minister in the Black Church of Cottesloe and New Brighton. But what happened then was that this message of what I wrote, it arrived in Port Elizabeth, and when I was in Stellenbosch, and everything was shipped, was created and shipped to Port Elizabeth, I received a call when I went back to my parents from Stellenbosch, and making myself ready to go to Port Elizabeth, I received a call that my call to Port Elizabeth was cancelled. But if I'm interested, I could go to Kala in the Transkei, because the people in Port Elizabeth wouldn't accept me because of my standpoint. That they saw that was a confirmation of Cottesloe. You see, because that is the. So I was identified with Cottesloe, and therefore I was not acceptable in Port Elizabeth, and that's how I landed up amongst the Xhosa people in the Transkei. That's more or less my arrival back in South Africa was rather traumatic. In fact, what I did when I went to Holland, I went to very specifically to Professor Balfen, because at the Free University of Amsterdam. He was the professor in science of missions. But when I was still studied, when I previously studied at the university, University of the Free State, I did also philosophy. So systematic theology was more or less rather my preferred subject. But I wanted to go into the mission, and that's why I studied missiology and wrote a thesis that was more systematic theology than a missiological study. So that is why it was called a mission, the unity of the church in missions. So that's how I also still in Holland still heard about Cottesloe. And then it was said at that meeting or whatever, whoever made the decision not to allow me to speak in Stellenbosch, they said that I'm in more or less confirm what's been said in Cottesloe, and that is why I became very controversial right from the start as a young student. When I got back here to South Africa, the whole thing around Belhar was already quite well known, and so I immediately got in touch with him, and I was then at the mission station. I was not in Port Elizabeth, but at Kala in the Transkei. That's the mission station at Kala. And I got in touch with Bay. and Umbay, and I went up, because of what happened to me, I went up to Johannesburg to meet with him. That was my first meeting with Bayes No Dear. And we kept on corresponding. And then, let me elaborate a little bit. There were quite a number of other, call it missionaries, together with me in the Transkei. The one was that I had a great respect for was David Bos. David Bos, he studied at Basel, and he was a missionary at Malwaleni. And we all decided to have a meeting, to come together, those missionaries. We were all thought to be the liberal side of the Dutch Reformed Church, to have a meeting in Idutwa. We chose Idutwa because we tried to get out of the, let me call it, the claws of the secret police. We didn't succeed, but in any case, we met, and for Bay to come down to address us. We had a meeting in Idutwa. My wife, just for the sake of interest, my deceased wife then, she was sitting outside because for one reason or the other, our male chauvinists, we were all male. There was no women allowed, or not allowed, but in fact not invited in the hotel in Idutwa. She was sitting outside, and she came in, and she whispered to me, there are 2 cars outside the hotel, and it is very clear that it is the secret police monitoring what was happening in Idutwa. So that was So I kept on my relationship with Bay, and what was interesting is that unnaturally, in a certain sense, to a predicant in the Dutch Reformed Church, I got the Sunday Times, because that was the only paper that I could read that in some way, sort of gave us an idea of what was happening really happening in South Africa. So and I also went up. Then I visited. Went back to Johannesburg, a meeting, to have a meeting with Bay, just to tell him, because he knew about me, and we wrote, and I had a meeting with him, with Bay, and it is at that stage it's still good to meet with people, because at a later stage he was only allowed one visitor. And then they met him outside his home and it wasn't under a fig tree, but they met there. And so I went to Bay, and I kept up my relationship with Bay, and then. Sorry to go on like this, but to tell something about my history.
That's wonderful.
And then while in the Transkei, in Port Elizabeth, KwaZulu, and KwaZulu, the congregation of KwaZulu, they heard about me, and for the first time, the black congregation, they were allowed to call their minister, and they called me.
Yeah.
And so from Tala, I went to Port Elizabeth, to KwaZulu, and when my wife and I, and we had At that stage, we had a little daughter of about 9 months old. They met me outside of Port Elizabeth. That was the old custom, meeting at the dominee outside, and to sort of guide him into
Yeah.
But that still there were for some missionaries. Some of the of the ministers in Port Elizabeth. They knew me because I was with them at the theological seminary at Stellenbosch. And when I got into the car, when they met us, he said to me, Jaap, I just want to tell you that there are people at work here trying to cancel your call to KwaZulu. So that was the kind of animosity that thesis of mine created. and eventually it didn't happen. I mean, there was nobody really protested. I knew that I came because I was going to the black church in KwaZulu, and I had very little to do with the white congregations, and there were one or two who were sympathetic, but I also got a cold shoulder for some of them. There was a division within, and that division was around Cottesloe and what happened to Cottesloe and my thesis. So I came back to South Africa in the 60s in a very controversial situation. That is something of my early experience of the Dutch Reformed Church.
Sure.
Eventually, I was called by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church to teach theology at the University of the Western Cape. Now, the University of the Western Cape in the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, the University of Western Cape was in the forefront of the resistance against the whole idea of apartheid and what the government was doing. I became great friends with Jake Scherwel, who later became the rector of UWC, and I was his deputy. It's so developed. In any case, the students of UWC, they were demonstrating more than they were studying. That you must have an idea of the 80s. That was turbulent times in the townships, and and so also the university and the university students, they were were at the forefront. And of course, at the same time, the police was very vigilant, seeing what was happening at the University of Western Cape. And I can tell you long stories, but to come back to that one, the students were demonstrating at the gate at Modderdam Road, and the police, they were standing on the other side of the road. They were trying to prevent the students from coming out of the campus, because that was the campus gate was there, and to come out of the campus and go into to the city of Bellville. And I was Richard van der Ros, the very prominent colored person who became rector at that stage. He was ill because of the unrest on campus. His health was detrimentally affected by what was happening. And I was, in fact, more or less in control of the university. And I got a call. The students are at the gate. The police are there. There's going to be a problem. So I went, tried to sort of to quiet down the whole situation. When I arrived, when I was there, when they saw me, I'm still at a later stage, I was honest to the police. When they saw me coming, and I wanted to quiet down the students, they say, go back to your classes. And then they start shooting. You can see all the students, they starting rubber bullets. And all the students were running away or ducking. I was so angry. I was so damn angry that I marched to the police. And they were shooting at me with rubber bullets past me. In fact, and now in my home, you will find I have a memento of have you seen what a rubber bullet looks like?
No,
It's not. It's a thick, yeah, and it can kill. And but I was so angry for the police because I said to them, "I'll quiet down the students and try to get them back to their classes." That somehow they just started to shoot, and that's what the picture is all about. I'm myself marching towards the police, and all the students ducking and to get out of the way of the police shooting rubber bullets. In fact, that picture became that is. I don't know where you got that one.
I've got my team.
You must have, but it became. In fact, it was some way submitted for some prize or the other. I was even interested. I was too much in the thick of the struggle at UWC to worry about a photograph of me charging the police. They're shooting at me with rubber bullets.
Did you get to them eventually?
Yes, I got to the officer, the commanding officer. I said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he ignored me. He just turned his back on me. So what could I do? Then I went back. But by then the student dispersed. That's what the picture tells you.
Yes.
The Belhar Confession was born in a classroom that I attended, my classroom. And I can tell you what, more or less, I tried to do it in sequence. We were studying a certain book of a Dutch professor, about reconciliation. And then, of course, it was a group of students, about 10 of them, the colored black students, who later became rector of Stellenbosch. Russell Botman was part of it. And I asked him the question, now, what is theologically wrong with apartheid? Don't tell me what is the sociological and ethical and all those kind of things. What is the basic problem with apartheid? They had a long discussion, and they were kept on at the practical implications of apartheid. I said, no, that's not what I want. Tell me what is the theological problem with apartheid. And I guided them, and then later they sort of, it dawned on them what I wanted. I wanted it that apartheid tells us that people of different races are not able to reconcile. It's the irreconcilability of people. That is why keep them apart, because they can't reconcile. They said that is straight against the gospel, the possibility of people reconciling in Christ. And so we have this whole thing of apartheid going through not only in the society but also in the churches. And in that case, the Dutch Reformed Church. I'm not referring now to the other churches, but they were of the what we call then the mission church, the church where the brown people or the so-called colored people were, and the white church. And say this is basically what the problem is. And then we drafted as a class. We drafted something in which we stated very clearly that apartheid, the whole policy of apartheid, is a sort of indictment. It tells us people cannot be reconciled. And that was, then the class decided, but then let's put this to the Synod, because the Synod was, in a few months' time, there was the Synod of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, let's call the so-called colored church. And let us put that to them from the class. But we need somebody to put it to the Synod, because we were not representatives on the Synod. And I got two members, two ministers who were willing to do that. Jan Mittler was one of them. I called them to my office and I said, are you willing, this resolution that we've made in the class, to put that to the Synod? And they said yes, they would do that. From there, the Synod accepted it, and it went through to the Council of Reformed Churches in Ottawa. Yeah. And then it was accepted, and it was there decided that apartheid is a sin. And this message then came back to us, back to the Synod in 1982. The first was 78, in 82. To the Synod, this resolution at Ottawa of the Reformed Churches of the world, the Council of Reformed Churches, and it was put to the Synod, and then the Synod said, "But no, if that is the case, no, actually." One person stood up. He's no more there. He's already died. Professor Baum. He stood up. And I wasn't part of the Synod because I was the theological school. He stood up. He said, "But if we make such a kind of a resolution, it must also be confessed. If you want to confess that." And immediately I was at the Synod meeting as a visitor at the meeting. The Synod decided, well, if that is so, needs a confession, then we will draw up a confession. And then a few of us were elected from outside, from theological. Myself, Turkey Smith, was then in my place in the systematic theology in the faculty, and Gustav Baum himself, and Ellen Busak, the four of us. So what happened then was that Dirkie Smith, who's now at Princeton, Dirkie Smith and I went to my office as a deputy vice chancellor of the university, and in my office we started drawing up the Confession of Belhar. I had a long struggle trying to just how to look at it, and then we decided, the Dirkie Smith and I decided that 3 things would happen, should be in this confession. First, the unity of the church, the reconciliation, and justice, because the unity of the church is that hampers the witness of the church. Reconciliation should be the message of reconciliation of people, also of different color and different groups. But because there is no reconciliation, we have injustice, and the poor whereas the gospel is very clear, the Bible is very clear on the poor and the oppressed. That was the three mainstays of the confession. That we decided in my office. And I wrote a few things, very little, and then Dirkie went back home. And the following morning, we were traveling from Stellenbosch. We lived in Stellenbosch in the car. He had his first draft of those three issues that we decided on. And that is how Belhar started. And it was taken to the synod, and they accepted it with a few. We first brought it to that commission where also Gustav Baum was and Alan Busak. They did nothing about it. At the later stage, some people said it was Alan Busak. Alan Busak had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with it. He was only at that meeting of the four of us to accept the concept that was drawn up by Dirkie Smith, myself. I was basically Dirkie Smith. I had the three, the basic structure of it. I came from me, and Dirkie filled it with wonderful words. It's a wonderful confession. And then it was accepted almost unanimously by the synod. And then it was as a draft confession, and then it was sent to the congregations of the Mission Church, of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, and by far the majority, the necessary majority, accepted it. And then in 1986 it was then officially accepted as a confession of the church. And we didn't expect what happened then. Then it became known overseas, and quite a number of other churches over the world, in America, in Europe, accepted Belhar. Some of them as a full confession, others as something like the Germans also had one, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer and those people who did that in Germany. It was not in the full confession, but the Belhar then was accepted as by many churches across the world, basically because some of them wrote to me that from the United States and from Europe accepted Belhar as a confession. Today, Belhar Confession has been accepted now by the Cape Synod, and also now it is part. It's not yet by the Dutch Reformed Church as a whole, but the Cape Synod, for instance, has accepted Belhar as confession. That is how it started. It started in a class of theological work. That's you can't imagine that something like this could start in a class of students thinking about why is there apartheid, as the impossibility of people to reconcile. And the result of the fact that it is impossible for people to reconcile, you have with apartheid telling us that that is so. People can't be reconciled, live together. And if it is possible to reconcile, then you have the testimony of the church. And that is what Belhar is all about. Justice means to be just to everybody. And that is why, and that is the third article of the Confession of Belhar. You can go and have a look at that if you want to have it, because otherwise I'm going to elaborate too much. That's what basically I want to say. This is a word that's been usually used without really knowing what it's all about. Because pietism, it means to be piety, it means to worship. But it is, later it became the idea that it is a more emotional thing. And and it is, how shall I put it? To be a pietist is to a certain form of worshiping God, and to away from a basic dogmatic kind of a dogmatic and it's very difficult to explain what I try to see, but it became a sort of a slogan about Afrikaner type of our type of theology, or a kind of religion. It's pietism. It is more. It has to do with our emotions, more to do with emotions than with the mind. That's nonsense. I don't think so. I'm not a pietist in the orthodox sense, but pietism has at least this in it, that it knows that the gospel also has got to do with one's emotions, and you can't really worship without emotion. It's difficult for me. That is more or less what I would like to say. And what the other thing is, that thing with the pietist is stands away from the world. A pietist doesn't want to get involved in the problems of the world and what happens there, and that's of course also nonsense. That's not true. I'm not a pietist, but I'm not against any form of pietism. Pietism has to do with being with your emotions, with your whole life, being in service of God. I think there's been a shift. I would think that to make it myself very clear, I'm not a member of the Dutch Reformed Church. I'm a member of the VGK, the Uniting Reformed Church. That originated from the colored and the black churches. I don't think that one is able, at this stage, able to to put a certain kind of a stamp on the Dutch Reformed Church and say, this is the Dutch Reformed Church. There are so many factions within the church. More, let's call it, I don't like the word, the more liberal, that would be in, let me put it this way, that are more in tune with the Belhar Confession, for instance. Others are not. They still think it is a kind of heresy and still adhere to apartheid. And I think one of the reasons, and that is one of the problems at the moment, where there's that all the efforts to find unity between the uniting Reformed Church, that would be the colored black section, and the white mega congregations, to find unity. In other words, it's not possible now to say the Dutch Reformed Church is this. It has so many factions in it, and it depends whether you're in the Cape or whether you're in Johannesburg or in Bloemfontein. Yeah. That is my experience. So I can't. I have difficulty in really defining what the Dutch Reformed Church is at the moment in terms of what's happening in South Africa. I think a lot of people have changed their minds because of the change in the political the political sphere. That's such a pity, because it should have been other ways around, because of your theological input and on the religious side, not from the political side. So in a sense, I think that many Dutch Reformed people were unprepared, were really unprepared for what happened with the change in government, and especially then the ANC government. And I think that one should not try to say, so is the Dutch Reformed Church. That would be wrong. You can't do that. There are too many factions in it of different persuasions. And you were still I think you will still very old, hard-nosed apartheid adherents, and others that have changed. So how do you describe the Dutch Reformed Church? It is a very broad church in that sense. I think we should start with that, first getting the unity, to show that we are willing to come to have unity with the other people, and that we're not some people apart as a white race or something like that. I think that is if we can get that message across, then it will be accepted. Look at what's happened now with the Rugby World Cup. Yeah. What wonderful sport! Can you believe it? That sport's doing what the church should have done to bring people together. Isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.